The Odyssey brings forth a multifaceted epic, a journey through many lands and seas, an almost surprisingly emotional and personal story of family and longing and connection. A man voyaging through the trepidations of the harrowing surroundings that mark his path, a son looking to do good by his loved ones to prove his worth, portray his able-bodiedness as a protector and kin to the greatness he is so cognizant of. A wife striving to maintain the hearth and home, to withstand the rigors of loss, to stave off the sinister aims of the many personages that lurk ever around her. And within it all, a journey into mythology, into the legends and tales and beings that were so tantamount to the era and to the people here and beyond. The Odyssey beholds all of these aspects and many differing events and happenings as this epic poem sets forth upon its renowned and memorable journey. The verse in which it was written stood out to me from the first. Iambic pentameter, as it appears to be called, it carries with it a rhythm and a preciseness that seems unique to it. It still somehow manages to maintain a level of storytelling and description, as is most often found in other novels and writings. It was interesting and a unique experience to read it as such, a differentiation from the usual structure and order of other books and readings. It seemed to bring out the events and occurrences in a newfound light, in a more direct fashion perhaps. It seemed much like a nice blend, a weaving of detailing and description with an accompaniment of directness and solidity. Sometimes the groupings even helped in categorizing the storytelling in a way, to organize it for assistance in its comprehension. Perhaps also it was a pleasant distinction in writing style, a brief reprieve from the usual diction. I also noticed the dialogue takes great strides in forwarding the story and plot, remarking on historical happenings or forewarning of future plights. Entire passages sometimes were derived of such conversations and dialogues to a great effect and impact. As I have heard from before, it was said that some of these verse-like poems were actually sung, perhaps in inns and taverns and the like, or even out in the city streets and village squares, perhaps even this very poem. I will not feign to consider this, given its style and qualities. It would be quite the performance, I'd say, to witness the recounting of such a poem in such a format, although I would also agree that the complete portrayal in its entirety would be somewhat difficult to pull off. Granted, perhaps only snippets were performed at any given time or with the transcription of it on hand. It appears to have even been said that the Odyssey itself was sung or performed in such a fashion in its original telling, which I would definitely consider given its form, and also agree with this being quite a proposition. Odysseus definitely brings forth his full countenance as title character and courage, battle prowess, emotional range and display, leadership, skill, and intelligence and strategy, noble attributes. Odysseus, being a complicated, complex man, differentiates him from other heroes, or at least might even bring to mind the concept of heroes altogether, their attributes and their deeds. For example, his frequency to sack cities or wreck towns and take part in the devious, even violent activities. But whereas he also worked to save lives, bring his men back home. Therefore, he can't be construed as an entirely devious being, perhaps a man, a human being, as it relates to all of us in its complexity anyway, although he would have heroic tendencies, could be said, or a heroic lean, and so being others might therefore consider and title him as such in its entirety. Calypso, the goddess, also conveys an intriguing concept and character into the mix in the poem, her strong connection to Odysseus and his journey. Whereas it didn't necessarily seem to me, in a broad sense anyway, that she was particularly malicious or sinister, especially to Odysseus himself. In actuality, it seemed she offered him many bright times, pleasures, and companionship. In addition, her aim and desire seemed quite regular or harmless, even warm, relatable, even human in its conception, the want for him to be her husband. Still, another partner awaited him in a faraway land, to whom Calypso herself would probably take little heed. Also, at times, it is described as her trapping him in her cave, which would obviously take a sinister connotation, although this observation might shift depending on the teller, perhaps. His daughter holds that poor unhappy man, so uncertain of their isolation, whether they would remain there upon this island or setting indefinitely, apart from any other civilization or people, or whether they might venture over to other populated areas from time to time. It is assumed, and probably notated thereof, that these particular excursions were probably scarce or non-existent. This could also bring up the necessity of such forays into civilized society or populated areas, and its need in different kinds of relationships or connections. This would also bring up Odysseus' heroic qualities, many might say, and his loyalty and moral character, and so portrayed in his desire to at least return to his land to check to check on his family, his wife, and his homestead, albeit Calypso's probably frequent ruminations and convincings that he need not partake in such lengths. In addition, it also brings forth the strained relationship between mortal and immortal, particularly of Odysseus and Calypso. The often shown differences that seem to ever be present, their differing desires, the tribulations that always seem to come about in their interaction. In some ways, however, it is often shown of their similarities as well. The poem also portrays the anger of the gods, or at the foremost, Poseidon. In so being, this anger must be difficult to comprehend, given his standing among beings. To put it plainly, I would not want to witness or even come to any kind of understanding of what this particular type of wrath might consist of. Granted, the already reminiscent experiences from those that surround us only accentuate this notion. It is also interesting to note the existence of any kind of anger or emotion from godlike beings or deities in its entirety. It seems the Greeks, or at least in this particular telling of mythology, often recount the presence of such emotions in their gods and goddesses, bringing up the question, to me anyway, of the existence of these qualities in them. If in some ways it might assist them in their goals and aims, or if it only hinders and morphs their considerations and acts. In some ways, if man were to come from gods in Greek mythology, then they would share in certain attributes and personality traits. Are certain emotions better than others? Should some be felt or displayed more or less than other emotions? This consideration aside, it would seem that Odysseus does get into frequent such disputes with the gods, Poseidon in particular, through perhaps debatable deeds and occurrences of his own. An unfortunate characteristic of his, I would say, a distinction that only seeks to thwart his path and progress. Whereas this is definitely offset, however, by Athena's numerous assistances and presence around him as he continues on his plight. I suppose some tribulations would have to be present on such a significant voyage for such a man as Odysseus, and for such an oft-told tale. I also must mention the grandness of the feasts that would take place during these times. 100 cattle and 100 rams, as I would most definitely at least to behold such a feast on an occasion, just to witness its perception. It would seem that these occurrences were grand celebrations, of which a great many activities took place: entertainments, speeches, ordainments, merrymaking, conversation, not to mention the actual feast itself. A chance for various nations and groups to come together to find camaraderie, if only for that moment. It seems at certain times or civilizations the meals may be less or less frequent, but also have with it the existence of such a grand events. I suppose it could be considered, if it is more appetizing or sought after, if it should be multiple smaller meals or a great feast to supplement a tiresome day. Here it is also mentioned of the great Atlas, father of the goddess Calypso, bringing to mind, to me anyway, the connection with the various natural surroundings and properties that are around us. Daughter of fearful Atlas, who holds up the pillars of the sea and knows its depths. It is intriguing how many of these myths, stories are able to seamlessly weave the world around us with the beings that are thus described. Whether it be the earth, the sky, the sea, the trees and the clouds, the sun and its warmth, the winds that blow on by. It really makes for a fantastical image and another layer of wonder to what we sense and encounter every day. Other civilizations have also incorporated such tellings in their cultures as well, such as multiple indigenous tribes and similar communities. Hermes is also mentioned here as with to inform Calypso of Mount Olympus's designation. I'd say that he must be frequented quite a lot between the other deities and being of much use to their aims and messages. Also his passages must also carry him to many a place and locale upon the land and sea, and even between realms, presumably. Even in the Odyssey he is often frequented and allied with in the many tasks and missions set about therein. Not a particularly insignificant or even undesirable countenance, I would have to say. Hermes heard these words. At once he fastened on his feet the sandals of everlasting gold, with which he flies on breath of air across the sea and land. The suitors also must make mention, as with it seems there are a great number of them. Even a single suitor might be cause for trepidation and turmoil, most definitely a few, whereas it appears Penelope and the household must deal with an entire crowd of them. It's also shown here their predominant nature and demeanor. Against the suitors who kill his flocks of sheep and longhorn cattle unstoppably. Therefore it appears, quite unfortunately, that their countenance is of a nature filled with malice, a result of perhaps courting or even any kind of occupation or want within a household or community that can go too far or eventually start to overstep its bounds or proceed forth maliciously if unimpeded, although the precise frequency of such occurrences would have to be determined. Not to mention the initial nature of certain endeavors and rivalries and competition that might crop up may also factor into certain countenances. Athena brings with her a significant and dominant role in the Odyssey, as is frequently seen in other works and tales, not only in helping Odysseus, but with Telemachus too in their many trials and tribulations, even in many ways going against the other gods upon the pantheon, particularly Zeus and Poseidon, showing, as seems also often shown, inner turmoil and discord within Mount Olympus, the differing viewpoints and ways of thinking between them, the turmoil that can flare up from this, and how it can sometimes then turn toward the world itself and its denizens, and Odysseus too for that matter. In many ways, Athena is a courageous and stalwart figure. Oftentimes it seems standing alone on her own tasks and aims, almost apart from the other members of the pantheon, in frequent instances in perception. She also seems to have a close, if not the closest, connection to the humans or the mortals, often helping them, assisting them in their tasks and hardships, being a warm and welcoming presence. This could also differentiate her from the other members of the Greek pantheon, in particular how she acts as a guide for Odysseus and Telemachus as well, being a compass and companion upon their missions and journeys. This kind of guide seems quite valuable for the characters, both in a practical sense but also emotionally, mentally, spurring them on when they might be faltering, coming up with ideas and craftsmanship when tackling their obstacles. It may bring to mind how valuable such a guide can be for all of us, how much need there is for such, the many ways or methods in which they might assist, and the many forms that they might take. In addition, how much this can blend with our own internal drive and direction. Telemachus plays a much larger role than I initially anticipated, being the son of the title character Odysseus. Seems he is on a vast journey all his own, although it might not span as far a distance or encounter such a quantity and enormity of monstrosities. The journey to live up to his father, to do good by him, his household, his homeland, to protect those that he loves and cherishes dearly, to prove that he is hardy and strong enough to achieve these goals and stand upon the podium of adulthood. For all these things, I say Telemachus achieves in great quantity. For not only must he battle and emerge from the inner strife that would otherwise naturally oppose him and many of similar ilk, he must do so on such a grand and heightened scale, and with a practical army of physical opposers at his doorstep. This would most definitely prove to make his task and plight all the harder, and incorporate an added complexity to his aims. But pull forward he does, sailing forth to find, to locate his renowned father, that he and his countryfolk have not seen for so long. He shows an inner determination, a grit that cowers before no foe, and also a loyalty and a resolve to maintain his father's possible whereabouts and the prospect of him still being alive and out there upon those perilous lands and waters. To this I much admired him, to maintain this resoluteness, this drive to save his family and household, even his countryland, both close by and beyond. I would say that he travels upon quite a journey of his own, making his way across the seas, much like Odysseus, meeting with many a personage, visiting many a land and hearth. Caliber of personage and presence in which he encounters is quite astounding, to say the least. There was a time I had come to realize that almost every countenance he came upon turned out to be some king or princess or other form of nobility. To this, Telemachus in particular would find much opulence and grand revelries upon his path, perhaps an aid in such a wearisome task before him. For when he arrives in Pylos, he will stay here tonight and go to sleep in your fine palace. Gerenian Nestor, horse lord, led them and led his sons and sons-in-law inside his own magnificent hall. When they were all inside, he seated them on benches and on chairs arranged in order, and he himself mixed up the bowl for them of sweet, delicious wine. When he goes to Sparta and meets upon King Menelaus, neighbors and family were feasting gladly under the king's high roof. The bard was singing and strumming, and 2 acrobats were spinning and leading them in dance. When he ventures to Scheria and the Phaeacians, and encounters Princess Nausicaa, then dawn came from her lovely throne, and woke the girl. She was amazed, remembering her dream, and in a fine dress went to tell her parents, whom she found inside the hall. Her mother sat beside the hearth, and spun sea-purpled yarn, her house girls all around her. Her father was just heading out to council with his renowned advisors, since his people had called them to a meeting. That's not to say that these noble characters need not have any challenges, tasks, or devious plans of their own. Seems that they most certainly might, their lofty standing factoring or not factoring into this particular characteristic. It would seem a skill all its own to deal with, to lithely circumvent such noble standings and the court and advisors, the other personnel that may most oftentimes be hovering nearby, to weave a conversation, allay to their wants, and to that which they are fond to exchange the proper pleasantries and take part in their customs and trades, even gift-giving, if so desired or required. To this, it seems, Telemachus is also quite successful. Quite a multifaceted figure, this Telemachus seems to be, adept in many arts. The house slaves poured fresh water on their hands, and boys filled up the mixing bowls with wine, and poured it into cups, and first prepared the sacrifice. They threw tongues on the fire, and sprinkled wine. Then each man drank his fill. That is to say that many of his meeters also seemed willful in their exchanges, relaying information if it pertained to his cause, providing a warm and abiding place to stay for his time there. Albeit, perhaps Telemachus was quite fortunate as well in this regard to encounter with such accommodating hosts. They all were silent till Achenius spoke up. He was an elder statesman of Phaeacia, a skillful orator and learned man. Wanted to help, he said. We arrived at that fine citadel. At last, I told him he should send me on my way, so he agreed to help me, and he gave me a bag of oxhide leather, and he tied the gusty winds inside it. Although perhaps this was also part of the plan preconception to meet with those that may be of this very nature, or otherwise have some other means of connection between them. It also goes to show just how much nobility or decorated persons resided in such an age, the numerous titles and lofty positions that seem to populate the lands, although I'm sure such a number would most probably also reside of an opposite sort, in poverty and minimal wealth. Perhaps today there is a similar number, or perhaps a similar countenance, among our population and society. They just go by different names and titles. All this and Odysseus himself has scarce been mentioned, whereas I'd also deign to say that Telemachus had quite the journey of his own. However, Odysseus may have a path that lies before it, the highest litany of fantastical beasts, perilous foes, and dangerous obstacles. However, that isn't to say that Telemachus, and later Odysseus himself, their forays into the tribulations of the humans or mortals would necessarily portray a less perilous or challenging experience in many aspects, and if looked at it from certain angles, perhaps. Even so, the sheer scope and size, the magnitude of creature and opposer would definitely maintain its significance in Odysseus' plight. Although at times it seems even Odysseus would meet upon similar circumstances. On approaching King Alcinous, Odysseus approached the royal house, and stood there by the threshold made of bronze. His heart was mulling over many things. The palace of the mighty king was high, and shone like rays of sunlight, or of moonlight. It also brings to mind the toughness of their toils, the unpredictability of it, how even the mighty can fall, especially in this era and time period. Our best warriors were killed. Ajax lies dead there, and there lies Achilles. There lies his godlike friend and guide Patroclus. My own strong, matchless son lies dead there too, Antilochus, who fought and ran so well. More pain, more grief, our sufferings increased. Who could recount so many, many losses? The Cyclops maintains its significance and well-known demeanor in his journey, that of which many a harrowing and gruesome, I'd have to say, occurrence would come about. It would suffice to say that such a presence would invoke such feelings of despair and fear, if not for the mere attribute of his strength and power, let alone his manner of dish. Interesting to note also his connection with the other gods and goddesses, an aspect to him I had not gathered or considered. The family tree seemed to spread and weave ever outward, in various directions, and even between various creatures and those of altered physical form. But he prayed, holding his arms toward the starry sky. Listen, earth shaker, blue-haired Lord Poseidon, acknowledge me your son, and be my father. Also to mention the veracity or visceral nature of such a monstrosity and his habits, a common occurrence, it appears, within the Greek mythology and similar myths. But he made no reply and showed no mercy. Leaping up high, he reached his hands towards my men, seized two, and knocked them hard against the ground like puppies, and the floor was wet with brains. He ripped them limb by limb to make his meal, then ate them like a lion on the mountains, devouring flesh, entrails, and marrow bones, and leaving nothing. Though it might be subdued somewhat, or toned back in certain retellings, still it truly displays the visceralness, even the brutality of such minds, tales, and myths, and even cultures, beliefs. It seems that much original recounting would hold within it a similar aura and content to show such imagery and portrayal that might not otherwise even enter the mind. The cultures and time period themselves might also waylay some significance in any kind of connection or comparison between the both of them. In any case, the Cyclops portrays such a countenance in its portrayal in the Odyssey. It would also have to show the intelligence and craftiness of Odysseus himself in circumventing such a foe. I would even say that this certain cave or island environment might have even sparked or ignited, triggered, or brought about some remembrance in him from a previous time and experience, I found myself considering. Even so, this didn't seem to hinder him in any way, he being much adept and attuned to maintaining his focus and concentration toward the task or mission in front of him. I'd say also that bravery and courage would also factor in here to where many others might have reacted in a much different manner. Not only did he have to orient himself around such fears and uncertainties, he also had to figure out to strategize a plan of departure, of escape, even ridding the world of this particular monstrosity, given the opportunity. And so he did, with some practical assistance from some of his crewmates, hiding the spears, craftily traversing upon the sheep in his exit, the method in which he named himself. But I was strategizing, hatching plans so that my men and I could all survive. I wove all kinds of wiles and cunning schemes. The danger was near, and it was life or death. I bound the rams in sets of 3 and set a man beneath each middle sheep, with one on either side, and so my men were saved. Also worth mentioning the somewhat regularity of the Cyclops' task, which I found to be interesting. We soon were at the cave, but did not find the Cyclops. He was pasturing the flocks. We went inside and looked at everything. We saw his crates weighed down with cheese and pens crammed full of lambs divided up by age. The newborns, middlings, and those just weaned. There were well-crafted bowls and pails for milking, all full of whey. For so great and terrible a creature to take part in such tasks as any other human would. A parallel there between them, perhaps a portrayal that they would all live in the same world, with all its many challenges and aspects, beings, and nature. A similarity that might give cause for camaraderie, if it weren't so malicious a creature as that of Polyphemus. The underworld presents yet another intriguing destination upon their travels, a locale that always holds some curiosity as to how it may be conveyed, the similarities and the differences. Although there are certainly many characteristics and features, aspects that would maintain its prevalence and be of a renowned or well-known manner. Aspects such as the river Styx and Cerberus come to mind. Even though it appears Odysseus only ventures to the perimeter of this place, it still brings about the feeling of foreboding and ominousness, mysteriousness. It really goes to show just how vast and significant the locale is if the venturing would only delve so deep as to that precipice. It is also of note the spirits or apparitions that he encounters, the discussions that they have, the connections that they share, its effect on Odysseus. Also of interest were the mentions of Persephone, her significance in the underworld, and her place in it, her complex story and experience, and the many layers or hues it would presume, the contrasting feelings or emotions or differences as a person and a being. But masses of the dead came thronging around with eerie cries, and cold fear seized me, lest the dreadful Queen Persephone might send the monster's head, the Gorgon, out of Hades. It is here his mother is affronted, from which a powerful and emotional bond still remains. In Odysseus, these bonds and connections seem significant and very much a part of his experience and being. Although these connections are all about him, and with multiple generations and in mostly pleasant ardor, it also seems to carry with it many a strained and difficult complexity and path. No, it was missing you, Odysseus, my sunshine, your sharp mind and your kind heart. That took sweet life from me. Sentiments that could find relation or similarity to others of likeness could be found here as well, perhaps in other aspects of his journey too. The sheer number of spirits is also of note here, those he encounters and even of those he would share conversations with. The scope of creature definitely reaches a heightened level when it comes to Odysseus' path and obstacles. It seems to hit all at once in quick succession, yet another hardship and challenge, and an aspect that Odysseus and his crew must navigate and endure. The sirens make yet another appearance, with their wily and devious ways, their pleasant and enticing nature, their malignant and deadly eventuality. Many a sailor would meet upon these beings upon their travels, to be taken in by their well-known allurement. In so being, it is of note that even Odysseus himself must tie himself to the mast, as with the crew members, utilizing physical means to resist the lures of their counterparts. The draw and nature of such an area is shown here, how devastating and powerful such feelings can be, both in this particular manner and perhaps also in the overall connections and desires between such bonds and people. The sirens who sit there in their meadow will seduce him with piercing songs. Around about them lie great heaps of men, flesh rotting from their bones, their skin all shriveled up. They bound my hands and feet straight upright at the mast. Their song was so melodious, I longed to listen more. I told my men to free me. I scowled at them, but they kept rowing on. In addition, Charybdis the whirlpool most definitely portrays an image of magnitude, a sight and presence that I would not want to get anywhere close to, that's for sure, a sentiment perhaps shared by other sailors and adventurers upon the stormy and dazzling seas. There are certain ideations or presences that really take on a heightened amount of unease, wariness, fear, and such beings would coincide with such feelings. Perhaps it is the sheer size of it, or maybe its destructive properties, or the many aspects of it that are unseen or unknown. Some aspect about these creatures or beings, however, seem to carry with it to invoke its foreboding nature. As with me, however, it is interesting to note that many of these aforementioned creatures or beings seem to be from the sea or otherwise correlate or reside in such oceans and bodies of water. Furthermore, Odysseus and his crew must also circumvent this foe of a more practical sense as well, guiding and navigating the vessel to avoid becoming drawn into its powerful currents. In this way, Odysseus must again put aside any quarrelsome inner feelings or uncertainties that might crop up, strategizing a method in which they might steer clear of this creature and continue forth on their journey. Scylla would for sure count toward these previously told anecdotes, yet another foe and significantly malicious being that Odysseus must prevail upon. It would appear that such a being might even stretch the properties and physical side of the mortal realm, and even its description would carry with it a view that would categorize it as such. She has 12 dangling legs and 6 long necks with a gruesome head on each, and in each face 3 rows of crowded teeth, pregnant with death. She is not mortal, she is deathless evil, terrible, wild and cruel. Even a god would be afraid of her. To come upon the clutches of Charybdis only to be met upon by such a malignance as Scylla must have surely been of considerable task. The return marks a significant moment in the telling, a long-awaited event, it being 10 years of battle in the Trojan War, another 10 years upon the open seas if accounts are to be perceived as such. The Trojan War also makes a significant event in mythology and Greek history, as primarily told in Homer's other epic, the Iliad, a grand conflict between the Mycenaean Greeks, or the Achaeans, and the Trojans in the city of Troy, where the wife of Sparta's king Menelaus, Helen, is taken away, sparking this great incident. She was abducted by the Trojan prince Paris. It is here that the famed Trojan horse comes into effect, a devious plan to infiltrate the city of Troy, housing within it a legion of Greek troops to where it was originally thought to be hollow, signaling the conclusion of the war. The length of the 10 years of conflict was due to the prolonged siege of the great city of Troy, to which such endeavors can maintain a lengthy struggle due to fortifications, defenses, the fortress-like qualities of such cities and structures. And so it was Odysseus, it would seem, had taken part in this storied war, partaken in its many hardships and challenges. The exact happening of it is still debated upon in its entire actuality, although there are many similarities or a similar occurrence that would reside between these factions and during this time period. It would be difficult to fathom just how such a moment would feel like, or the many thoughts and considerations that could be going through his mind at such a time. I would presume it might even be difficult for Odysseus himself to put into exact words. With that, the goddess made the mist disperse. The land was visible. Odysseus, after so long a wait and so much pain, was filled with happiness at last. In joy he kissed the fertile earth of his own country. At times, perhaps, the experience just happens, and there is naught we can do but experience it in full, letting it course through body and minds. But alas, the moment arrives, and he stands once more upon the very land he has been yearning after for so long. Of interest is his maintaining of the disguise in which he traverses his homeland at first. It can reveal just how much someone's likeness can affect their dealings and interactions, their surrounding perceptions. And also Odysseus is resolved to keep this guise, even though there would presume to be some desire to mate with his kinship as himself, I'm sure. The presence of the suitors, those quarrelsome foes, may very well have contributed to the insistence to require upon this continued distinction. Although I can also sense a tad of trickery within him too, perhaps, to really relish the moment when he might finally reveal himself, to have a play at his loved ones and his fellow folk for a time, so that the moment of wonder and amazement might be all the more significant and ravishing. A situation that not many people might be able to encounter, or at least not very often. To outwit you in all your tricks, a person or a god would need to be an expert at deceit, you clever rascal, so duplicitous, so talented at lying. You love fiction and tricks so deeply, you refuse to stop even in your own land. Yes, both of us are smart. No man can plan and talk like you, and I am known among the gods for insight and craftiness. Odysseus, the Lord of Lies. A sentiment perhaps shared by Athena herself, it would seem to appear, a similarity, a connecting attribute between the two of them. Although breadth of such usage in these ways are sure to differ in certain amounts, I would say. But then the fateful meeting comes, when he must meet upon those meddlesome foes that have been pestering his home for such this long while. Another feast, it would seem, although of much deceit and ill will, served up with the dishes. The suitors gathered round and spoke to him in friendly tones. At heart, they meant him harm. A mention of Penelope must needs take mention here, her endurement of the opposers for such an amount of time, or her willingness to wait for Odysseus, to hold out hope for her beloved companion, as well as her benevolence toward her son and all of her household. In addition, her cleverness and wit to deceive or allay these suitors with the interweavings of her craft, this idea that sprung up from her mind. By day I wove the web, and in the night by torchlight I unwove it. Penelope forewarning Telemachus of the suitor's plan of ambush as well. In so being, it must be said that she also plays a quite major part in the complexities of this epic, in the navigation and maneuverings of maliciousness from the exterior, the delicacy and intricate nature of the heart. However, the day finally arrives when her lover makes a triumphant return, although perhaps not entirely to her expected visualization. Perhaps she can sense a shift in the air, though, even if her guard has been so much hardened and calloused after so long a time it has been of her unfortunate and unseemly circumstance. Her heart cannot decide if she should keep her distance as she was questioning her own dear husband, or go right up to him and kiss his face and hold his hands in hers. A great competition is then declared, of it seems well-known accord, also of a type that seems ever prevalent in such delegations of individuals of such likeness. A much unique kind of competition, as it seems has rarely been foundationed or set forth often. Perhaps that was Odysseus' intention, knowing that this uniqueness might bring with it a good deal of challenge. Also knowing, though, his counterpart's probable willingness to take part in such a display and endeavor. And so it was with a grand performance from Odysseus himself. The victor is crowned and the tension reaches the tipping point. So he had tricked them all, after examining the mighty bow carefully inch by inch, as easily as an experienced musician stretches a sheep-gut string around a lyre's peg and makes it fast. Odysseus, with ease, strung the great bow. He held it in his right hand and plucked the string, which sang like swallow song, a clear, sweet note. I must henceforth remark on the stalwartness and courage and prowess Odysseus, Telemachus, and their companions display when assuming the battle against their accrued foes, for however much they lacked in numbers, they greatly made up for in skill, dexterity, strength, and intelligence, technique, strategy, and it does seem the numbers were quite skewed against them, even significantly so. But their enemies kept falling, their resolve showing no signs of decreasing, and finally, their foes lay dismantled before their eyes. The full capability of Odysseus is much shown here, as well as his sons for that matter. The day is theirs at long last, their homeland restored, their bonds renewed. Then at last the king ran out of arrows. He set down his bow next to the sturdy doorpost, leaning up against the palace walls, all shining white. He slung the fourfold shield across his shoulders, and put the well-made helmet on his head. The crest of horsehair gave a fearsome nod. He grasped a bronze-tipped spear in neither hand. The competent, sharp-eyed Odysseus and his companions hurled their piercing spears into the swarming throng. Odysseus' father also takes mention, an interesting dynamic between the two. For as much significance there may be between Odysseus and Telemachus, it seems there is even yet another generation lying in wait. For who could presume the likeness of such a figure as the father of such a legendary countenance? Well, the poem reveals as such in their meeting and conversation. Truly a showing of the many phases of human life, from the rigors and tribulations of battle and adulthood to the becalmed tending to farms and cattle, although I'm sure there are also differences with many. I'd also say an element of mysteriousness exudes from this figure as well, in his mannerisms to the actuality of his many deeds and feats. Odysseus' father was alone, inside the well-built orchard, digging earth to make a level round a tree. He wore a dirty, ragged tunic, and his leggings had leather patches to protect from scratches. Thoughtful Laertes said, "O Father Zeus, Athena and Apollo, If I were as strong as when I took the sturdy fortress of Nericus out on the mainland shore when I was king of Cephallenia, I would have stood beside you yesterday with the weapons on my back and fought with you against the suitors who were in our house. However, the conflict seems to not yet be concluded, as another band of interlopers makes their presence known upon their lands, displaying perhaps the sheer difficulty of Odysseus' plight and also perhaps of the ongoing nature of such tensions to certain extents. Odysseus and his compatriots' courage shine through once more, however, as they take up arms to defend, to protect their families, their homeland, their hearth and home again. However, Athena makes an appearance, yet another situation that shows her uniqueness among the others within the pantheon, her multifaceted nature, her many aspects and ways of consideration, of perception. There must be others that would share upon her layers, but it seems she truly and most completely embodies it in its entirety. The forthcoming battle is seized, and peace is once again discovered throughout the land. The Odyssey truly displays a vast and all-encompassing tale that spans many continents, traverses many seas, but also explores the intricacies of humanity and its bonds and connections. The gods themselves take significant part in these paths, although a particular countenance makes considerable contribution. Many a beast is circumnavigated, battles are fought, love is found and restored again. An epic, great heroes, a journey through many lands, seas, and conflict, a voyage into mythology.